Number 3. Robert Matthews. In the autumn of 1966, Robert Matthews was a 19-year-old junior in the Air Force. On October 1st, 1966, he got off a bus for his first tour at a base in North Truro, Massachusetts. The bus driver told Matthews to phone the base and they would send a truck to pick him up. After getting out the bus, Matthews walked to a phone booth outside of a grocery store called Dutra's Market. Matthews called the base at around 8:45 p.m. His colleague said that someone would pick him up in a minute. While Matthews was waiting for his ride, he saw lights in the sky moving towards him. Suddenly, he was overcome with fear. He picked up the phone and called the base again to tell them something strange was happening. His colleague asked him where he had been. Matthews said he hadn't moved from where he had been standing in front of the grocery store. His colleague said that the truck pulled up at 8:50 p.m., about 5 minutes after he made his call, and he didn't see anyone waiting. Matthews made a second phone call to the base at 9:45 p.m. It had been nearly an hour, but Matthews thought it only had been a couple of minutes. Someone picked Matthews up, and when we got to the base, he was heavily questioned. Air Force personnel asked him where he had been and asked him to describe the lights. He stuck to his story. They had been in front of the grocery store the entire time. Matthews said he had not been drinking. The Air Force personnel didn't believe him, but eventually everyone moved on. Matthews worked at the base, and then he went on to serve in Vietnam. It turned out that Matthews' loss of time in 1966 was not his only strange paranormal experience. When he was 5 or 6 years old, he woke up and saw a strange green figure in his bedroom. Matthews sat up and tried to scream, but he couldn't. He thought he had lost his voice and his hearing. Then everything went black. When he woke up, he was lying in bed. The creature sat next to him on the bed, pulled up his PJ top, and did something to his chest. Matthews told his mom the next day that there was a ghost in his bedroom. His mother told him that he was just having nightmares. For more than 30 years, Matthews kept that incident a secret, and he doubted his sanity. After the war, in the winter of 1987, he was on vacation and he was looking for a book to read. He stumbled across the book, Intruders, The Incredible Visitations at Copley Woods by Bud Hopkins. The cover had an illustration of a greenish alien with a big skull, large black eyes, no ears, and a slit for a mouth. When he read the book, he was convinced his experience as a child was not a dream. The creature on the cover looked exactly like the being he saw in his room that night when he was 5 or 6 years old. So Matthews reached out to the author of the book, Bud Hopkins. Hopkins conducted interviews with Matthews and then put him under hypnosis in the hopes of uncovering more details of his experiences. Hopkins believed that hypnosis was an effective way to find lost memories. Under hypnosis, Matthews recounted the night in front of Dutra's Market. He said he saw 3 lights moving and hovering above the parking lot. Then a red light came towards him faster than he could blink. The light landed in the parking lot, and he realized it was actually some kind of aircraft. A ramp opened from the aircraft, and Matthews saw 3 aliens sitting on the left and 2 sitting on the right. Matthews said that the inside of the craft was clean and clinical. Matthews then remembers sitting on a bench inside the craft with his shoes and shirt removed. The aliens examined his chest, and 2 of them had a discussion. Hopkins, the author of the book, said that Matthews' story is typical of other time-lost stories he's heard. Hopkins said missing time usually involves people being taken into UFOs and their clothes are removed, and blood, sperm, or skin samples are taken. What happened to Robert Matthews after he shared his story with Hopkins is unknown. but he did recount a story for an episode of Unsolved Mysteries. It aired on November 30th, 1988. Number 2. Terrell Copeland. Suffolk is a city in northwest Virginia, not far from the North Carolina border. Terrell Copeland lived there in 2000. That year he joined the U.S. Marines and was at the Northwest Naval Base in Chesapeake, Virginia. One early morning between 3 and 4 a.m., Copeland saw an object shine a spotlight. At first he thought it was a helicopter, but was only about 100 feet away, and it didn't make any noise. The light turned from yellow to green. Then he saw that the craft was shaped like an oval. Then the aircraft flew off. 5 years later, Copeland saw something similar. On October 24, 2005, he was walking near the Great Dismal Swamp National Wildlife Refuge in Virginia. He saw a large ball of light high in the sky about 2 miles away. He saw 2 military fighter jets flying near the orb of light. 3 days later, on October 27th, he was at his parents' home in Suffolk. At about 7 p.m., he saw a blue orb in the sky. It appeared 2 nights later, and this time he tried to follow it in his car. But he couldn't keep up. On October 31st, after 11 p.m., the orb showed up again. Copeland followed it in his car, and it led him to a shopping center. He pulled into the parking lot. That's when he realized that there were 2 orbs. Not just that, it was a huge aircraft, and the orbs were lights that were attached to the aircraft. The aircraft was triangular shaped and it was flying about 500 to 700 feet above his car. At first, Copeland thought it was an Air Force bomber, but he had never seen any aircraft that big while he was in the service. Once again, the aircraft simply flew away. In 2005 and 2006, people living in and around Suffolk filed 12 reports of UFO sightings in the area. On January 29, 2006, a local newspaper reported the sightings of glowing shapes over Virginia Beach that changed directions quickly, and triangles flying over Suffolk. But these sightings were reported by people who were far away from the glowing shapes. Copeland's sightings were unique because he saw the objects at closer distances. On March 5, 2007, just after 8 p.m., Copeland was driving. He noticed lights in the sky about 30 feet away from him. 2 objects hovered in one spot and then started to change colors. He grabbed his phone and started filming it. Copeland thought that the orb changing colors was communicating with the other orb. Copeland saw a military helicopter flying towards the orbs, and suddenly the orbs disappeared. He posted his video on YouTube. After his experience, someone showed up at his apartment claiming to be a military contractor. The person asked Copeland if he was ready for the truth. The person said they had a personal relationship with aliens. After a couple hours of talking, the person left. Copeland took a nap on his couch. He woke up to the sound of someone trying to get into his apartment. He could see the doorknob moving and he could hear scratching at the door. He wanted to grab his gun, which was on the table, but he was paralyzed and he could only move his eyes. He heard a voice through the door say, "You don't need that weapon. We won't harm you." When Copeland was finally able to move, he opened the door and no one was there. For the next 2 nights, Copeland woke up at 3:08 a.m. Then, before he could blink, his alarm clock would go off, and suddenly it was 5:30 a.m. On the 2 consecutive nights, he had somehow lost 2 hours. Then in February 2008, he suddenly remembered parts of his lost time experiences. He remembered sleeping and then suddenly waking up in a big dining hall. Everything was white, and beings who looked like humans were eating. Copeland was still dressed in his pajamas. He thought he was having a dream. But later, he ended up back in his apartment and saw that the speakers that he kept on his windowsills had been moved. He thought that the aliens had moved the speakers so that they could get him through the window and into their aircraft. Another time, he was in a room with a woman who didn't have human features. She had black eyes and an elongated skull. The next memory he has is waving at a cylinder craft from his balcony. Terrell Copeland appeared on the TV show UFO Hunters. The host of the show told Copeland he was probably an alien-human hybrid that was being prepared to meet his alien relatives. Copeland said he was surprised, but not that surprised. Copeland says he has a blood disorder, which is why he's no longer in the military. Copeland's blood has excessive amounts of an enzyme called creatine kinase. Copeland has 10 times the amount of this enzyme compared to the average person. But he has never received a diagnosis, so he was discharged from the Marines after 2 years of service. Allegedly, it's common that people who experience sightings like Copeland have blood disorders like the one he has. Copeland thinks that the aliens have noticed him for some reason, and that these experiences will lead to something bigger. He says he still regularly sees UFOs around Suffolk. Number 1. Betty and Barney Hill. Betty and Barney Hill met in 1956 at a mutual friend's place. They became friends, and eventually they fell in love. They married on May 12, 1960 in New Jersey. Then they settled in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. At the time, Betty was a social worker for the state of New Hampshire. Barney started serving in the Army when he was 18 in 1941. He had been a marksman and a truck driver. He was discharged in 1944. In September 1961, Barney got a job as a distribution clerk in Boston, Massachusetts. He would commute for work between Portsmouth and Boston. In September 1961, Barney asked for a few days off to surprise Betty with a trip to Niagara Falls and Montreal. They left for their trip in their car on September 17th. Barney put Betty's pistol under the floor mat of the car. They visited Niagara Falls, Toronto, the Thousand Islands area, and then Montreal. On September 19th, they decided to head home. That night, they were driving through New Hampshire's White Mountains. Betty was in the passenger seat when she saw what she thought was a falling star, but it stopped in the sky and then started to move upward toward the moon. She told Barney to stop the car to see it for himself. By the time he did, the object was falling towards them. Barney thought it was just an airplane, but he did think it was strange that the object could move so abruptly. He kept driving, and the object kept following them. They drove around a rock formation through a valley called Franconia Notch and saw a flat disc hovering about 100 feet above their car. Barney stopped, and he grabbed a pair of binoculars. The disc suddenly stopped and moved to an adjacent field and flew above the treetops. Barney grabbed the gun and walked towards it. The disc was about 80 feet in diameter, and it was silent. It had a double row of rectangular windows. As Barney got closer, 2 fins appeared out of the object. The fins had red lights on the end, and they tilted towards Barney. Barney wanted to aim the gun at the craft, but something took over him, and he could only stare at the craft with the binoculars. Through the binoculars, Barney saw 8 to 11 figures watching him through the windows. They looked human-like, with black uniforms and black caps. The craft started flying down towards him. Barney ran away, but the craft caught up with him and was flying directly over him, making rhythmic, buzzing tones. Barney managed to make it to the car, and they drove off, but again heard buzzing sounds down the road. They saw a huge red and orange orb on the road, but they couldn't identify what it was. They made it home to Portsmouth, and they expected it to be 3 a.m., but suddenly the sun was rising, and it was 5 a.m. They somehow lost 2 hours. When they got inside their home, Barney said, "That was the most amazing thing that's ever happened to me." They both felt calm, peaceful, and relaxed. They showered and went to bed. The next morning, they went into 2 different rooms and they drew the object they saw. Their drawings had very similar details. Betty and Barney both noticed that their watches stopped working sometime between September 19th, when they saw the UFO, and the next morning. Barney's pants had pieces of plant on them, and the shoes he was wearing the night before were scraped up. The leather strap for his binoculars was broken. Betty's dress was torn. The trunk of their car had some shiny spots that had not been there before. Betty told her sister, Janet, about what they saw. Janet consulted a neighbor she trusted, who was a former police chief. He suggested that Betty and Barney report their sighting to the Peace Air Force Base. Betty called the base in Newington, New Hampshire on September 21st, 1961. Betty and Barney described the UFO, but Barney left out the description of the creatures because he was afraid of being judged. An Air Force official sent their report to Project Blue Book. Project Blue Book was the United States Air Force's investigation of UFOs. The project ran from 1947 to 1969. 12,618 UFO sightings were reported to Project Blue Book. Most were explainable, but 701 sightings were deemed unexplained. The entry in Project Blue Book said that the objects the Hill saw were most likely natural causes, like weather conditions. It also said that the source of the lights were unknown by the characteristics of an advertising searchlight. Advertising searchlights are meant to attract attention for things like movie premieres and grand openings at events. The searchlights can send light miles into the air. But in the case of the Hills, they saw the lights at 11 p.m. during an off-season in an area with a very small population. Ultimately, the Blue Book concluded that there was insufficient data to make a conclusion. But someone in the Air Force saw something strange the same nights the Hills did. A report from an air controller describes an Air Force personnel who saw an unidentified aircraft on the radar 4 miles from the control tower. The aircraft came in within half a mile of the tower, and then the radar signal dropped. Project Blue Book had another radar sighting of an unidentified object flying erratically from North Concord, Vermont. The sighting happened on September 18, 1961 at 5:22 p.m. That was less than 6 hours before Betty saw the UFO, and it was about 17 miles away from where she saw the UFO. The report concluded that it was probably a weather balloon, but others in the Air Force said it must have been a large aircraft. The object went northwest and then south, and it was tracked for 18 minutes. A weather balloon would have traveled in a west-east direction with the flow of the jet stream. A jet stream is a wind current high above the atmosphere. The object on the radar traveled against the current. Some people believe that the Air Force was covering something up. The Hills told their close friends and family about their sighting. They also contacted organizations they thought might be able to explain what happened, like the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomenon, or NICAP. A few organizations interviewed the Hills and wrote reports on their sightings. NICAP published a report entitled A Dramatic UFO Encounter in the White Mountains, New Hampshire. Over the next few months, the Hills returned to the White Mountains multiple times in the hope of remembering more, especially about those 2 missing hours. When they returned home after one of their visits, they were shocked by what they found. There was a pile of dried leaves in the middle of their kitchen table. Underneath the leaves were the earrings that Betty was wearing on the night they saw the UFO. No one else but them had keys to their home. Over the next several years, Barney saw a psychotherapist. In 1963, family members were asking Barney questions to help him jog his memory about what happened during those 2 lost hours on the night they saw the UFO. Suddenly, he remembered men in the road signaling them to stop the car. The car motor died, and then the men walked up to the car with a sway that didn't look human. But this still doesn't answer how they lost 2 hours that night. So in 1964, Barney and Betty decided to try hypnosis to recover memories from that night. During the sessions, Betty recounted nightmares she had. In one of her nightmares, she saw human-like creatures. They were dressed in navy blue pants and short jackets with military caps. In her nightmares, they took her and Barney to a landed aircraft in the woods where they underwent physical exams. The leader of the creatures could speak English, but he had an unrecognizable accent. These creatures would take nail clippings, earwax, skin scrapings, and samples of their hair. Betty's dress was removed, and a long needle was put into her navel. These creatures looked in disbelief when they were able to take Barney's dentures out, but they couldn't take out Betty's teeth. Later in the nightmare, Betty asked the leader of the creatures for a souvenir to bring back to prove she hadn't lost her mind. She found a book with symbols and wanted to take her with her, but they wouldn't let her. Betty asked the leader which planet he was from, and he pulled out a map that had points on it, and the points were connected by lines. The creatures led the hills back to their car once Barney's examination was over. Many of Betty's nightmares were variations of this story. On March 7, 1964, under hypnosis, Betty and Barney recalled what happened to them in more detail. Betty remembered the car making a sharp left turn off the highway. Barney said that an external force made the car turn off the highway for him. The eyes of one of the creatures in the craft entered his mind and told Barney to calm down. Then Barney and Betty saw a group of beings walking towards them. Their car motor died suddenly. Betty tried to run away, but the beings split into 2 groups and surrounded their car. Barney described the beings as humanoid figures with slanted eyes unlike any human. Under hypnosis, Betty remembers she and Barney walking through the woods with these beings. Betty described them as being between 4 to 5 feet tall, with gray skin tone, bluish lips, and dark eyes. Their heads were big, their noses were flat and small, and they had slits for mouths. The beings led them to a metal oval craft on the ground. They walked up the ramp, and Barney hit his feet against the opening of the craft, which scuffed his shoe. Once the hills were inside, in English, the leader assured Betty not to be afraid. Barney was brought into an operating room and put on a table. The beings removed his shoes and pulled down his pants. They turned him over and put a small tube in his rectum. They touched his skin on his back like they were counting his vertebrae. The men turned Barney over and took a skin sample. The examiner checked Barney's ear and seemed curious about its structure. Betty's exam was similar, minus the rectal exam. But she did get a pregnancy test done by inserting a needle into her navel. The examiner left the operating room and Betty was alone with the leader. She told him that this experience was outrageous and no one would believe them. Just like in her nightmare, she asked for something to take home with her as proof. She found a book on a cabinet which had lines and dots inside of it. The leader let her take the book. Betty asked the leader where he was from. He pulled out a map which had dots all over it and curved lines were connecting them. She asked where on the map did he live. The leader said, "If you don't know where you are, there wouldn't be any point in my telling you where I am." The examiner came back into the room with Barney's dentures. He examined Betty's teeth. She didn't have dentures, and the creatures were confused about why Barney's teeth could be taken out, but hers couldn't. Betty said sometimes as people get older, they have to have their teeth replaced. The leader asked what old age is. Betty explained that humans usually live for 65 to 70 years. The leader did not understand what this meant. Once Barney's exams were done, Barney was led back to the car. Another crew member told Betty she could not take the book as the leader promised her. The creature said it was because they wanted to erase their memory. Then the leader walked Betty to her car, and Barney was already in the driver's seat. Barney remembers an orange ball of light, then suddenly he and Betty were in darkness. Barney and Betty then drove on the main highway. They made it home at 5:20 a.m. After the hypnosis session, the Hills finally understood what had happened to them. Aliens had abducted them. But the hypnotherapist didn't believe in UFOs and thought they were just recounting Betty's nightmares in a shared fantasy. But Betty and Barney were sure that these things happened to them. In April 1964, the hypnotherapist asked Betty if the beings looked like pictures of aliens. Betty said she had never seen photos of aliens. The hypnosis sessions ended in spring 1964. The Hills were disappointed that the hypnotherapist thought their experiences were just dreams. The hypnotherapist had even said it's impossible to lie under hypnosis. Betty believed that she had nightmares about that night, but she also strongly believed that the events of September 1961 were real. A senior officer in the Air Force listened to the Hills' hypnosis session recordings, and he also believes that their experiences were real. In September 1965, the Hills drove towards the White Mountains and found the spot where they encountered the roadblock. They walked into the woods until they came to a clearing. They found tire tracks from a car and charred trees. They believe that this is the exact spot where their car suddenly turned off the highway and where they came across the aircraft. Eventually, the Hills moved on with their lives and promoted liberal and social political issues. They both became envoys to the United Nations. Barney was heavily involved in the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. He was also involved with civil rights in the New Hampshire government, and he was nominated for the state's Human Rights Commission. Betty continued to work as a child welfare worker with the state of New Hampshire. During this time, the Hills did not talk publicly about their story. They didn't want the publicity because they thought it would ruin their lives. But in 1965, a reporter with a Boston newspaper contacted the Hills because he found out about their story from a friend of theirs he had interviewed. Initially, they ignored his request for an interview. But then the reporter got a copy of their Project Blue Book file, and he spoke with Air Force officers and members of NICAP. He also knew that they saw a hypnotherapist. On October 25, 1965, the reporter's story appeared in the Boston Traveler. The story thrust the Hills into the public eye. Journalists surrounded their home, called them, and even showed up at their workplaces. So Betty and Barney decided to talk to the press. They held a press conference a couple weeks after the article was published. The Peace Air Force Base public information officer spoke to a crowd saying UFO sightings were taken seriously and should be reported to the base. The Hills said that the article had been published without their consent and that the hypnotherapist couldn't adequately explain the 2 hours of time they lost. Over the years, the Hills did more interviews. A book called The Interrupted Journey was written about their story, and a made-for-TV movie based on their experiences called The UFO Incident aired in 1975. After the story went public, the Hills regularly saw UFOs fly in strange flight patterns. Even Betty's parents saw the UFOs. In 1967, Betty's health declined and she took a leave of absence as a child welfare worker. Barney's health went downhill in 1968. He had a serious stroke and died on February 25, 1969, at the age of 46. Betty was devastated by the loss of her husband. Later, in 1969, Betty received a letter from Marjorie Fish, a schoolteacher with an interest in UFOs. Under hypnosis in 1964, Betty drew the map that she saw in the UFO. That map went public when the media got hold of the story. Fish had a hobby of locating the stars on Betty's map. After a lot of research, Fish found only one pattern of stars that matched Betty's map. Is the sky seen from a planet orbiting the stars Zeta Reticuli? Astronomy magazine published several articles about the map and the Hills' experience in the 1970s. Betty's health deteriorated by 1975 and she retired at age 56. In 1995, Betty wrote and self-published a book called A Common Sense Approach to UFOs. She wrote about her research on UFOs and her sightings. Betty Hill died of cancer on October 23, 2004, at the age of 85. The Hills always believed that they were abducted. They spent their lives doing interviews with scientists and people from organizations to further UFO research. Their account is said to be the first widely publicized alien abduction. Thank you so much for watching this video. We hope you found it interesting. If you did find it interesting, please make sure you subscribe. We'll have a new video about the paranormal every week. If you just discovered this channel, please make sure you check out our other channel, Criminally Listed. We have over 325 videos featuring bizarre but true crime stories. You can find it at youtube.com/criminallylisted. We also have a podcast about cold cases that were eventually solved called Criminally Listed Presents Into the Killing. You can find it on Stitcher, Spotify, Amazon Music, and anywhere you find great podcasts. But that's all for today. Thanks again for watching.